Introductions and conclusions, ways to think about them, and tips for writing them. There are many, many, many people who are much, much, much smarter than me who have commented that in life there are no endings or beginnings, that things are circular and cyclical, and you can't just choose a stopping or a beginning point sometimes. You can look at life that way. But when we talk about introductions and conclusions, especially in academic papers, I think it's useful to remember that idea that your paper should kind of create a circle. It should bring you back to the beginning. Most academic papers are not explorations, they're arguments. And so if you're making an argument, it should be circular. Not a circular argument, not like the logical fallacy, but your introduction should state what the argument is. And then you support it and you give evidence. And by the time you get to the conclusion, it's a more polished version of your introduction. And so they should be similar in a lot of different ways. So think about introductions and conclusions as an ice pack. You have a piece of cloth. And the piece of cloth is going to contain ice. The ice, in this case, is all of your actual argument. It's the evidence, it's the main points, it's the reasoning behind your argument. But if you don't connect all that with the cloth, it's not going to function the way it's supposed to as an ice pack, okay? So the introduction is that part of the ice pack that's kind of smooth and that's going to touch your skin. It's the place where it functions and where it can be useful. And the other side of the cloth, where it's bunched together and much more specific and held together with a rubber band, is your conclusion. And if you think about introductions and conclusions this way, you can see how they're so connected to each other. They're the same thing. They just present differently. One side is smooth, and it's an easy place to touch it and to get to the ice and its coldness and the effects of the ice and how it's functional. And the other side is bunched together and holds everything in place so that you know how it all works, kind of. If you think about introductions and conclusions this way, they might make more sense to you. And it's really, really important to remember through this whole metaphor that the cloth, the introductions and the conclusions, are both made of the same cloth. So they're connected and they are similar. They have the same pattern, and they are the same thing, a way to contain your argument. Tip 1, revise introductions and conclusions heavily. They're hard to write. They're really hard to write. And I would suggest that you revise introductions and conclusions heavily, especially introductions. In a lot of cases, I will write my way through a paper and I'll write the conclusion, and then I will almost use the whole conclusion for my introduction and rewrite my conclusion, if that makes sense. Tip 2, keep introductions focused and straightforward. You know, in high school and middle school and even elementary school, we were often taught to use things like hooks and to use questions and sometimes to use current events or quotations in our introductions. Those are all fine, but don't rely on them. In academic writing, especially in college writing, you might just want to be as straightforward as you can and talk about the topic and kind of provide basic information about the topic before you get into your thesis. Tip 3, your thesis should be in your introduction. I would, just as a rule of thumb, try to include the thesis in your introduction, unless you're writing something that's longer than 20 pages. Because, you know, things get more complex once you write 20 pages. And I
I like to put my thesis at the end of the introduction because I think the ends of paragraphs are memorable to people as they read. It's kind of like, oh, here's where I can stop and take a breath. And if the thesis is there, it lingers with that breath. You're like, oh, okay, now I'll dive into everything else. And so, that's a very normal structure, but I think it really does help.
Tip 4, conclusions are a reminder of the major points of your argument.
It's good to remind your reader of where you went. So if you had an argument about money and you were talking about, the fact that change is not as useful as it used to be, and that people are using digital versions of money and credit cards way more than they used to. You want to touch on all those different elements in your conclusion and remind the reader what they read. But you want to do it in a subtle and an elegant way. You don't want to hit them over the head with it, but you do want to remind them. And so I often write my conclusions and I hit everyone over the head. Like, first, we talked about this. Second, we talked about this. Third, we talked about this. And then I revise it so that it doesn't hit you over the head as much. And I take out anything that is more than a reminder that might bog the person down.
Tip 5, make sure your conclusion doesn't bring up new ideas you haven't explained fully.
It is very, very, very important, though, not to bring in new elements of your argument in your conclusion. I can't stress this enough. Like, you can bring in new ideas. Maybe you have a quotation from someone that really is a good example of where you've been going with this paper. That's totally okay in a conclusion. But if you bring up new elements of the argument, the readers are going to be left with questions. Why didn't we talk about this? Why is it now that you brought this up? What are you actually saying about that? This is not finished, is what goes through a reader's head if you bring in a new element of an argument. So make sure that it really is reminders of where you've been.
Tip 6, conclusions are a place to remind us why your argument matters.
Think about how this might apply to life, and use that very subtly, not introducing a new idea necessarily, but reminding us of how this is useful information and how this paper and this argument has been useful.